The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched for miles in every direction, and thousands of alien delegates filled the floating platforms that hung in the air like leaves on an endless tree. The light from 3 artificial suns bathed everything in a cold blue glow, and the air hummed with the sound of translator devices working overtime to convert 100 different languages into something everyone could understand. Ambassador Park Dae-sung stood alone on the human platform, and he looked very small compared to the massive creatures that surrounded him. Some delegates had bodies like mountains covered in scales, and others floated in tanks of liquid because they could not breathe normal air. A few were made entirely of light, and they flickered like candles in a storm. Dae-sung was 73 years old, and he had served humanity in this council for over 30 years. His hair had turned white long ago, and deep lines crossed his face like rivers on a map, but his eyes were still sharp, and his back was still straight. He wore a simple black suit because humans did not believe in showing off. Behind him stood Admiral Kim Hana, and she was everything he was not. Where Dae-sung was calm, she was fire. Where he spoke softly, she commanded armies. She had led human fleets through 12 major conflicts, and she had never lost a single battle. Her silver hair was cut short and practical, and her uniform carried enough metals to sink a small ship. But today, even Hana was quiet. High Speaker Veloth rose from his platform, and his body unfolded like a flower made of bones and metal. He was the leader of the Dominion, and he had pushed hardest for this vote. His voice boomed across the hall like thunder. The vote is complete, he announced, and his many eyes swept across the assembly. 847 in favor, 1 against. Humanity is hereby expelled from the Galactic Collective. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Dae-sung felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders like stones. He had known this was coming for months. The other species had grown tired of humanity, and their endless energy, and their loud voices, and their strange habit of solving problems nobody asked them to solve. Humans were young compared to the other races. Most species in the council had existed for millions of years, and they had learned to move slowly and think carefully and never act. Without centuries of debate, humans lived for less than 100 years, and they were always in a hurry, always rushing to build and explore and change things. The council called them children, and they meant it as an insult. Zing stepped forward, and every eye in the hall turned to him. The delegates expected anger because humans were famous for their tempers. They expected threats because human ships were powerful and numerous. They expected begging because surely the young race would not want to lose access to galactic trade and technology. Instead, Dae-sung simply nodded. "You have made your decision," he said, and his voice was steady. He spoke in English and let the translators do their work. "We accept it." Veloth leaned forward, and confusion crossed his alien features. "You accept it," he repeated. "Yes, there will be no appeal. No, you do not wish to address the charges against your species." Dae-sung smiled, and it was a sad smile full of things he would never say. "What charges?" he asked. "You say we are too aggressive, but we have never started a war in galactic space. You say we are too emotional, but our diplomats have solved more conflicts than any other species. You say we are too young, but we have given you medicines and technologies that your ancient civilizations never dreamed of." He paused and looked around the hall. "You do not want us here," he continued. "That is enough. We will not stay where we are not wanted." Admiral Hannah stepped up beside him, and her face was hard as stone. "But know this," she said, and her voice cut through the air like a blade. "We will remember how you treated us. We came to you with open hands, and you slapped them away. We offered friendship, and you gave us scorn." Hannah, the ambassador, said softly, and she fell silent. Dae-sung turned back to Veloth. "We will be gone within 72 standard cycles," he said. "Every human ship and station and outpost will be evacuated. The jump gates connecting our space tiers will be closed. You will have what you wanted." He bowed then, and it was a deep bow, full of respect that the aliens did not understand. In Korean culture, such a bow was reserved for elders and teachers and those who deserved honor. Dae-sung gave it to the council, not because they deserved it, but because that was who he was. Then, he turned and walked away, and Admiral Hannah followed him, and the doors closed behind them with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. The evacuation began that very night, and it was the largest movement of people in human history. Millions of humans lived on stations and colonies throughout galactic space, and they had built lives and businesses and families there. Now they packed what they could carry and said goodbye to friends they would never see again. Young-soo was one of the junior diplomats on Dae-sung's staff, and he worked without sleep for 3 days straight, organizing transport ships and coordinating with human colonies. He was only 28 years old, and he had dreamed of serving humanity among the stars since he was a child. Now that dream was dying. "Sir," he said to Dae-sung on the second night, "why didn't we fight? We have ships. We have weapons." "The council cannot force us to leave." Dae-sung looked at him with tired eyes. And then what he asked, "We fight a war against the Des. Entire galaxy. We kill millions, perhaps billions. And even if we win, what have we become? That they are wrong about us." Young-soo insisted, "We have done nothing but help them." The ambassador nodded. "Yes, they are wrong, and someday they will understand that, but we cannot force them to see the truth. They must learn it themselves." On the third day, the last human ships crossed through the jump gates, and then the gates went dark. The borders of human space sealed shut, and the connection between humanity and the galaxy was severed. Dae-sung stood on the bridge of the final ship and watched the gate fade behind them. Beside him, Admiral Hannah was quiet for a long time. "Do you think they will regret this?" she asked. Finally, Dae-sung closed his eyes and remembered all the years he had spent among the alien races. He remembered the plagues he had helped cure, and the wars he had helped end, and the famines he had helped prevent. He remembered the friends he had made, and the enemies he had turned into allies. "Yes," he said softly, "they will regret it. How long? Not long. The galaxy is more fragile than they know, and we were holding more together than they ever realized." The ship jumped into hyperspace, and Earth grew closer with every passing hour. Behind them, the galaxy continued to turn, and the council celebrated their victory, and nobody noticed the first small cracks beginning to form. But the cracks were there, and they were growing, and soon the whole galaxy would learn a terrible truth. Some lights do not know how bright they are until they go out, and humanity had been the brightest light of all. 3 months passed, and the galaxy began to fall apart. It started with small things that nobody noticed at first. A trade route that became a little more dangerous, a medicine that became a little harder to find, a negotiation that took a little longer to complete. But small things have a way of growing, and soon the small things became big things, and the big things became disasters. The Volturi were the first to suffer, and they suffered greatly. The Volturi were a peaceful species who looked like tall, thin birds covered in golden feathers. They had no military because they believed violence was primitive, and they had survived for 1,000,000 years by trading with everyone and threatening no one. Their cargo ships carried goods across the galaxy, and everyone depended on them. But the neutral corridor, where most of their ships traveled, had always been dangerous. Pirates and raiders lurked in the asteroid fields, and they waited for easy targets. The only thing that had kept them in check was fear of Commander Yoon Ji-won and her human patrol fleet. Ji-won was 45 years old, and she had spent 20 years hunting pirates through the dark spaces between stars. Her ships were fast and her crews were fearless, and her reputation was legendary. Raiders told stories about her in whispered voices, and they called her the ghost of the corridor because she seemed to appear from nowhere, and her justice was swift and absolute. Under her watch, the corridor had been safe for 15 years. Her task force maintained a 94% deterrence rate, which meant that almost no pirate was stupid enough to attack when human ships might be near. But the council had called her methods unnecessarily militaristic. and they had complained that humans were too quick to use force. Now, G1 was back on Earth, teaching at the Naval Academy, and her ships were gone, and the corridor was dark. Raiders noticed they attacked the Velthari cargo fleet on a quiet night. When no one was watching, 14 ships were destroyed in less than an hour and 2,000. Velthari were taken hostage. The raiders sent a message to the council demanding payment, and they laughed because they knew no one would come to help. The Velthari ambassador begged the council for intervention, and the council debated. They debated for 6 weeks. They argued about jurisdiction and responsibility and the proper use of military force. They formed committees and subcommittees and working groups. They wrote reports and analyzed data and scheduled more meetings. By the time they reached the decision, the hostages were dead. The raiders had grown tired of waiting, and they had no use for prisoners who could not pay their own ransom. The bodies were left floating in space as a warning to others, and the Velthari mourned, and the council expressed deep regret, and nothing changed on the agricultural world of HFY. The crops began to fail. HFY was one of 12 worlds that had been saved by human technology. 100 years ago, the planet had been dying, and its soil was too poor to grow anything, and its people were starving. Then Dr. Beek Sumin Arivazumin was a geneticist, and she had spent 40 years developing hybrid seeds that could grow in any soil. She had created plants that needed almost no water, and crops that could survive in darkness, and fruits that contained every nutrient a body needed. Her work had fed billions of people across the galaxy, and she had never asked for payment or praise, but her seeds needed a special fertilizer to reach their full potential. The formula was complicated, and it required human manufacturing techniques that no other species had mastered. Sumin had shared the formula freely because she believed knowledge should belong to everyone. Nobody had bothered to learn how to make it. Why would they? The humans were always there to provide it. The humans were always there to solve problems. The humans were always there until they weren't. Crops on HFY began to wither, and the harvest failed, and the people began to starve. The planetary governor sent desperate messages to the council begging for help, and the council turned to the Velthari traders. But the Velthari ships were afraid to fly, and the trade routes were collapsing. Agricultural Minister Yethru stood before the council, and his voice was heavy with shame. We assumed they would always be here to provide it, he admitted. We never thought to learn ourselves. Someone suggested contacting Dr. Beek directly, but her communication channels were closed. She had returned to human space with everyone else, and she lived now on the colony world of New Sol, where she tended a small garden and did not answer messages from the council. She was 93 years old, and she had given her entire life to feeding strangers. The council had called her work primitive human meddling, and they had suggested that her interference was disrupting natural development on developing worlds. Now those worlds were hungry, and Sumin was planting tomatoes in her backyard, and she felt no obligation to respond to people who had thrown her gifts back in her face. The Dominion began to expand. The Dominion was an empire of conquest led by High Speaker Velith, and they had always wanted more territory. But they had been held in check for centuries by a simple fact. The humans had allied with the Dominion's border rivals, and any expansion would have meant war with Earth. Humans were dangerous enemies. They were creative and predictable, and they fought with a ferocity that terrified older species. Their ships were not the biggest or the fastest, but their tactics were brilliant, and their soldiers never surrendered. Even the Dominion, with all its power, had not wanted to test itself against human fury, but the humans were gone now, and the alliance was broken, and the border rivals stood alone. The Dominion took 3 systems in the first month. They took 5 more in the second. The conquered species sent pleas to the council, and the council debated. And the debates went nowhere, because nobody wanted to fight the Dominion. Nobody except the humans had ever wanted to fight anybody in the halls. of the Great Council building delegates whispered to each other in dark corners. The humans would have stopped this, they said. The humans are gone, others reminded them. By our own decree, refugees began to flood into neutral space, and they brought stories of horror and destruction. They spoke of worlds burned and populations enslaved and cultures erased. They asked why nobody had helped them, and nobody had a good answer. Speaker Veloth watched all of this from his platform, and something cold began to grow in his chest. He had led the vote to expel humanity. He had called them children and pests and evolutionary accidents. He had celebrated when their ships disappeared through the jump gates. Now he looked at the chaos spreading across the galaxy, and he began to understand what he had done. The humans had not just been members of the council. They had been the glue holding everything together. They had patrolled the trade routes and fed the hungry worlds and held back the conquerors. They had solved problems before anyone else even noticed the problems existed, and the council had thrown them away like garbage. Veloth returned to his private chambers that night, and he sat alone in the darkness, and he thought about what the future might hold. It looked very dark indeed, and somewhere in human space, Ambassador Park, the Zoo sat by a window and watched the stars and waited for the message he knew would eventually come. Speaker Veloth had not slept in 14 days. His species did not need sleep the way humans did, but they needed rest and meditation and quiet time to process their thoughts. Veloth had none of these things. He had only reports, and each report was worse than the one before. He sat in his private chamber surrounded by floating screens, and each screen showed a different disaster. Medical shipments delayed indefinitely, trade routes collapsing, border conflicts escalating, refugee populations exploding, food shortages spreading, and underneath all of it, like a drumbeat that would not stop, was a single terrible truth. The humans had been holding everything together. Veloth reached out with one long bony finger and touched a screen. The display changed to show medical statistics, and the numbers made his stomach turn. Human pharmaceutical companies had produced 40% of the galaxy's emergency medicines. They had developed cures for diseases that had plagued other species for millennia. They had shared their research freely, and they had trained doctors and built hospitals on worlds that had never known modern medicine. All of that was gone. Now the factories had closed, and the shipments had stopped, and the stockpiles were running low. On a dozen worlds, patients were dying because medicines they needed no longer existed. The council had tried to replicate the human formulas, but the chemistry was beyond them. Human science had always been strange and intuitive, and it seemed to work by rules that nobody else could understand. Veloth switched to another screen, and this one showed navigation data. Human astronomers had maintained the most accurate star charts in the galaxy. They had mapped hyperspace lanes that nobody else could find, and they had tracked asteroid movements and solar flares and gravitational anomalies. They had updated their charts constantly, and they had shared them with everyone because they believed that knowledge should be free. Without those updates, the charts were degrading. Ships were flying blind through dangerous regions, and accidents were increasing every day. A Velthari cargo vessel had flown straight into an asteroid field last week because their charts said the field was not there. 300 crew members had died. Next screen showed diplomatic records, and Veloth felt something crack inside his chest. Humanity had served as neutral arbiters in over 300 ongoing conflicts. They had mediated disputes between species that had been fighting for thousands of years. They had found compromises that seemed impossible, and they had built trust between enemies who had never trusted anyone. The humans had a gift for understanding other perspectives. They lived such short lives that they could not afford to hold grudges. They forgave quickly and moved on, and they expected others to do the same. This confused the older species, who remembered insults from 1,000,000 years ago, but it also made humans perfect mediators. Without them, the old conflicts were returning. The Krallian Hive and the Stone Lords had been at peace for 2 centuries, thanks to human intervention. Now they were mobilizing fleets, the Void. Singers in the Crystal Collective had signed a treaty brokered by Ambassador Park himself. Now they were exchanging threats. Wars that humanity had prevented were about to begin, and once they started, they might never stop. Veloth closed his eyes and thought about the day of the vote. He remembered how confident he had felt, how righteous. The humans were annoying and disruptive, and they never followed proper protocols. They spoke too loudly and moved too quickly, and they had no respect for tradition. They treated the Great Council like a problem to be solved rather than an institution to be honored. But they had solved problems. Nobody could deny Thate Veloth had simply assumed that the problems would stay solved after the humans left. He had assumed that the medicine would keep flowing, and the trade routes would stay safe, and the peace treaties would hold. He had assumed that everything would continue as it always had. He had been a fool. A soft chime sounded, and Veloth's aide entered the chamber. Marth was young by their species standards, barely 200 years old. He had been assigned to Veloth after the human expulsion, and he had watched his master grow more troubled with each passing day. High Speaker Morth said carefully, "The council requests your presence." There has been another incident. Veloth did not open his eyes. What now? The Dominion has taken the sanctuary worlds. Veloth's eyes snapped open. The sanctuary worlds were protected space, a dozen small planets where refugees from ancient wars had built new lives. The council had declared them neutral territory 1,000 years ago, and no one had ever violated that declaration until now. High Speaker Veloth began. "I know." Morth interrupted, and then he caught himself. "I apologize. I should not have speak freely." "Morth, I am too tired for formality." Morth hesitated, and then the words came rushing out. "The humans would have stopped this." "High Speaker, everyone knows it. Their fleet was the only force the Dominion feared. Without them, there is nothing to hold the expansion back. Nothing at all." Veloth rose from his seat and walked to the window. The view showed the great city that surrounded the council building. Millions of beings lived there, representing hundreds of species, and they all depended on the council to keep them safe. The council had failed them. "We did not realize." Veloth murmured. Morth moved to stand beside him with respect. "High Speaker, we did not want to realize. We saw only their flaws." "Tell me what you mean." The young aide gathered his thoughts. "The humans were loud and messy, and they did not follow our rules. They aged and died so quickly that many species considered them barely sentient. They fought among themselves constantly, and they made decisions based on emotion rather than logic." Yes, Veloth agreed. "That is what we saw, but they also fixed things." Morth continued. "They saw problems, and they could not help but solve them. They encountered strangers, and they could not help but befriend them. They faced a void, and they could not help but fill it with light and noise and stubborn, relentless hope." Veloth thought about Ambassador Park standing alone on his platform, receiving the judgment of the galaxy. The old man had not argued or threatened or begged. He had simply bowed and walked away. That bow haunted Veloth's dreams. Now he had researched human customs, and he had learned what the bow meant. It was a gesture of respect given to teachers and elders, and those who deserved honor. Park had given it to the council, even though the council deserved nothing but contempt. That was who the humans were. They gave respect to those who had earned only shame. They helped those who had rejected their help. They loved those who had cast them out. "We must contact them," Veloth said. "High Speaker, the communication channels are closed. The jump gates are sealed. We have no way to reach human space. Find a way." Veloth turned to face his aide, and his many eyes were bright with desperate determination. "We were wrong, Morth. We were blind and arrogant and foolish, and if we do not fix this mistake, the galaxy will tear itself apart." Morth bowed. "And if they refuse to answer, then we deserve whatever happens next." The young aide hurried away to begin the search for a way to reach humanity. Veloth remained at the window and watched the city below and wondered if it was already too late somewhere. In human space, Ambassador Park Dae-soon was growing weaker. His body was failing after so many years of service. And his doctor said he did not have long left, but he held on because he wanted to see what would happen next. He wanted to see if the galaxy could learn. He wanted to see if there was still hope. And, in the end, hope was all that any of them had left. The message took 3 weeks to reach human space. It traveled through back channels and neutral traders and independent ships that owed no loyalty to the Council. Marath had worked without rest to find a path through the sealed borders, and he had finally succeeded by bribing a smuggler who knew secret routes between the stars. The message was simple. The Galactic Council requests communication with human leadership regarding reconsideration of expulsion status. Admiral Kim Hana received the message on a cold morning in New Seoul. She was 62 years old now, and retirement had not softened her. The silver in her hair had spread, but her eyes were still sharp, and her posture was still perfect. She read the message 3 times, and then she sat in silence for a long while. Her aide, a young officer named Shin Tae-young, waited nervously by the door. Admiral, he finally said, "What does it mean?" "It means they are scared," Hana replied. "They are finally scared enough to admit they were wrong." "Will we respond?" Hana stood and walked to the window of her office. The view showed the orbital construction yards of New Seoul, and they were magnificent. Hundreds of ships hung in the void in various stages of completion, colony vessels, and exploration craft and research stations. After the expulsion, humanity had not wasted time feeling sorry for themselves. They had turned inward and started building. They were constructing a future that did not depend on the Galactic Council, a future where humans would explore and grow and thrive on their own terms. "We will respond," Hana said, "but on our terms." Not there. She drafted a reply and sent it through the same channels. The Council wanted to talk, and humanity would talk, but the conversation would happen when humanity was ready, and not a moment sooner. 2 days later, the communication link opened. Hana sat in the command center of the New Seoul Defense Station, and a massive screen dominated the far wall. The screen flickered, and then High Speaker Veloth appeared. His alien form filled the display, and his many eyes blinked in the artificial light. "Admiral Kim Hana," he said, "your species has agreed to communicate. We are grateful." Hana did not smile. She did not bow. She simply stared at the creature who had led the vote to cast her people out. "High Speaker Veloth," she replied, "we received your message. Council wishes to discuss reconsideration of your species status." "Reconsideration?" Hana let the word hang in the air. "Yes, there have been unforeseen difficulties since your departure." Rune Ferezenvon shifted uncomfortably, and his body made clicking sounds as his joints moved. "The trade routes have become dangerous. The medical supplies are running low. The border conflicts are escalating. We find ourselves in need of assistance." Hana leaned back in her chair and studied the alien on the screen. She thought about all the years humanity had spent serving the Council, all the lives they had saved and the problems they had solved, all the gratitude they had never received. "Tell me, High Speaker," she said, "when you voted to expel us, did you consider what would happen afterward?" "We believed the galaxy would continue to function as it always had." "You believed wrong?" "Yes. We believed wrong." Behind Hana, the viewport showed the construction yards. Ships were being built every day, and soon humanity would have the largest independent fleet in the known universe. They were not waiting to be invited back. They were preparing to forge their own path. "Admiral, please," Veloth said, and there was something in his voice that might have been desperation. "We acknowledge that perhaps the Council acted hastily. Hana stood and walked closer to the screen. "I watched your Council debate for 6 hours about whether humans deserved basic membership rights. I listened to delegates call us galactic children and evolutionary accidents. The Council was wrong." Ambassador Park Dae-soon served the collective for 30 years. Did you know that he dedicated his entire life to building bridges between species? He gave everything he had to the galaxy. "I know of Ambassador Park He was respected even by those who voted against humanity. He died last month. Valath went still, his many eyes fixed on Hana, and something changed in his expression. The old ambassador is gone. He died in his sleep, surrounded by his family. He spent his final days teaching his granddaughter about the stars. He never spoke a bitter word about any of you. Not once. Even after everything you did to him, he held no anger in his heart. Veloth was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was heavy. "I am sorry. I did not know of." "Of course you did not know. Why would you cast us out, and then you forgot about us until you needed something. Admiral, I understand your anger, do you?" Hannah stepped even closer to the screen, and her eyes burned with cold fire. "Do you understand what it felt like to watch the only home we had ever known outside Earth reject us? Do you understand what it meant to tell millions of humans that they had to leave their lives behind because the galaxy had decided they were not welcome? I cannot fully understand, I admit that. No, you cannot, but I want you to try. I want you to imagine what it would feel like to give and give for centuries, and then be told that none of it mattered, that you were still just children playing at civilization." Veloth bowed his head, and for the first time, Hana saw something like shame in his alien features. "We were wrong," he said again. The words seemed to cost him something. "Yes, you were." Hana returned to her seat and composed herself. "I will bring your request to our council, but I want you to understand something, High Speaker. If we return, and that is a very large if, we will not return as your servants. We will not return as children to be managed and controlled. We will return as equals, or we will not return at all. And if your council refuses, then we wish you well. Truly, we do not hate you, Veloth. We never hated you, but you will face the darkness without us." Screen went dark, and Hana sat alone in the command center. Taeyang approached hesitantly. "Admiral, do you think they understand Naus?" "Of them," Hana replied. "Perhaps not all, but some." She thought about Ambassador Park and his gentle wisdom. She thought about Dr. Beak and her stubborn generosity. She thought about all the humans who had given so much to a galaxy that had never appreciated them, and she thought about what humanity would decide when the council was finally ready to ask them to return. "We will have to choose," she said to herself. "Will we hold on to our anger, or will we let it go? Will we punish them for their mistakes, or will we show them what mercy really means?" She did not know the answer yet, but she knew that whatever humanity decided, it would be the right choice, because that was what it meant to be human, to face impossible choices and somehow find a way through. The Human Council met in the Great Hall of New Seoul, and the debate lasted 4 days. Representatives from every colony and station and ship gathered to decide the fate of their relationship with the galaxy. Some had traveled for weeks to be there, because this decision was too important to leave to anyone else. Every human voice deserved to be heard. President Cho Mina sat at the center of the council, and she listened to every argument. She was 58 years old, and she had been elected 3 years before the expulsion. Her entire presidency had been defined by leading humanity through the greatest crisis in their history. The isolationists spoke first, and their arguments were powerful. "We owe them nothing," declared Senator Kang Dae-ho. He was a tall man with a fierce voice, and he had lost his daughter in the evacuation. She had been a doctor on a medical station, and she had stayed behind to treat patients until the last possible moment. The stress had broken her heart. "We gave them everything, and they threw it back in our faces. Why should we return to be mistreated again?" Others agreed. "We can build our own future," they said. "We have the ships and the technology and the will. We do not need the galaxy, and the galaxy does not deserve our help." The integrationists responded with equal passion. "We cannot abandon billions of innocent people," said Ambassador Yoon Hae-jin. She had served under Park Dae-sum, and she carried his legacy in her heart. The council made a terrible decision, but the common people did not vote for it. Children are starving on worlds we once fed. Patients are dying without medicines we once provided. Are we going to let them suffer for the sins of their leaders? But they supported the decision. Someone shouted from the crowd. They cheered when we left. Some cheered, Hygiene admitted, but many wept. I was there. I saw the tears in the eyes of friends who had no power to stop what was happening. We cannot paint an entire galaxy with the same brush. The debate continued through the night and into the next day and the next. Tempers flared and voices rose, and more than once President Cho had to call for order. Admiral Kim Hanna spoke on the third day, and the hall fell silent when she rose. I have spent my entire life fighting, she said, and her voice carried the weight of decades. I have killed enemies and lost friends and watched good people die for causes that sometimes felt hopeless. I know what it costs to protect others. She paused and looked around the hall. But I also know what it costs to turn away. When we close our eyes to suffering, we lose something inside ourselves. When we refuse to help because we are angry, we become less than what we should be. So you think we should return? Someone called out. I think we should do what humans have always done. Hana replied. I think we should argue and debate and disagree, and then come together and make the choice that feels right in our hearts. Not the easy choice, not the safe choice. The right choice. The debate continued, but something had shifted. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Something that looked like hope. On the fourth day, Dr. Biksu Min asked to speak. She was 93 years old and she needed help to reach the podium. Her body was frail and her voice was thin, but when she began to speak, everyone leaned forward to listen. I have spent my life feeding people who were not my own. She said, I have created seeds that grow in poison soil and medicines that cure diseases I had never heard of. I have given everything I have to strangers who could never repay Mesh. Paused and her old eyes swept across the assembly. Not because they deserved it, not because they were grateful. I helped them because they were hungry and I could feed them. I healed them because they were sick and I had to cure. That is what it means to be human. We help even when it hurts, even when they do not understand, because that is who we are. The hall was silent. If we refused to return, Sumin continued, we are saying that our help was conditional. We are saying that we only gave because we expected something back. But that is not true, is it? We gave because giving is what we do. We help because helping is in our nature. She gripped the podium with shaking hands. The galaxy heard us. Yes, this is true. But the galaxy is also full of innocent people who did nothing wrong. Children who are hungry, patients who are sick, refugees who have nowhere to go. Are we going to punish them for the arrogance of their leaders? Are we going to become the very thing they accused us of being? Her voice grew stronger. We are humans. We are stubborn and loud and emotional, and we never give up. We rush in where others fear to go, and we fix things that others say cannot be fixed. This is our gift. This is our curse, and I would not have it any other way. She stepped back from the podium, and someone helped her return to her seat. The vote was called, and the results came quickly. Humanity would return. First ships crossed back into galactic space. 6 months later, and they did not come as conquerors or as servants. They came as what they had always been: helpers and healers and builders and dreamers. The fleet carried doctors and engineers and diplomats and teachers. It carried seeds from Dr. Beek's gardens and medicines from human laboratories. It carried Hope. Ambassador Lee Young-soo stood on the bridge of the lead ship and watched the stars stream past. He had been Park Dae-sung's aide, and now he carried the old man's mission forward. His mentor had not lived to see this day, but Young-soo felt his presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. The great hall of the Galactic Council was full when the human delegation arrived. Every platform was occupied, and the silence was absolute. Young-soo walked to the central podium and looked out at the assembled species. He saw fear in some eyes and hope in others. He saw shame and gratitude and confusion and relief. We have returned, he said, and his voice echoed through the vast chamber. High Speaker Velith rose from his platform. The Council welcomes humanity back. We have prepared a new membership agreement with enhanced status and privileges. Su held up his hand. We did not come back for status or privileges. Then why? Velith asked. We came back because there is work to be done. We came back because people are suffering, and we can help. We came back because that is who we are. He paused and thought of his mentor and the bow that had haunted the Council's dreams. We did not return because you asked. We did not return because you apologized. We returned because mercy is not given to those who deserve it. It is given to those who need it. The hall was silent, but know this, Young Su continued, and his voice grew firm. We remember how quickly you forgot everything we gave. We remember how easily you cast us aside. We remember the contempt in your voices and the scorn in your eyes. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably, and we return anyway, because forgiveness is not about the past. It is about the future. Because holding on to anger only poisons the one who holds it. Because we choose to be better than our worst impulses. He bowed then. Just as Park Dae-sung had bowed months before, it was a deep bow full of respect and dignity and hope. And this time, every delegate in the chamber bowed back. The galaxy had learned at great cost a simple truth. Some lights do not realize their brightness until the darkness returns, and humanity, loud and chaotic and impossibly stubborn humanity, was the brightest light of all. They had left quietly, and the consequences had been immediate and terrible. They had returned quietly, and the healing could finally begin, not because the galaxy deserved it, but because helping was simply who they were, and that made all the difference.